You're listening to What It's Like with Luce, a podcast highlighting ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I'm your host, Lucy Norris, and on today's episode, I'm picking the brains of a serial entrepreneur. Growing up in Monaghan, this week's guest began his rollercoaster career journey as a radio officer in the British Merchant Navy. Realising it was perhaps a job that could only take him so far, he left, went on to gain some more qualifications, and for the next 30 years found himself working with Shell Mex and BP. Relocating back to Ireland led him to discover his first solo business idea that appeared in the form of tomatoes, and well, the rest is a long and exciting history. At 87 years old, having just rewritten his memoirs in the book Adventures of a Serial Entrepreneur, here's what it's like to be Fred Duffy. So if we just get straight into it, if you don't mind, I think that a nice place to start to let people get to know more about your background is to have a bit of a chat about what it was like for you growing up in Monaghan.
So growing up in Monaghan was lovely. My mother had managed to find a property in the centre of the town. The centre of Monaghan is called the Diamond, and it had the advantage going back to the 30s. We're going back a long time now. There was cement. The thoroughfare was cement, which may not sound much, but it was easier. Cement was great for spinning tops and for hoops and for all the kids' marbles, all the things one child would do. It was great for that. It was also the centre of the town. So remember, I was only 4, 5, 6, 7 growing up. I was party to everything, and I had lots of fun.
Were you always interested in setting up your own business? Did you know from a young age that's what you wanted to do, or was that something that just happened naturally later?
As a child, I do remember quite clearly that I would lie in bed at night and consider my mother and father had a sweet shop, and I thought if I could fill my cupboard with sweets, I could bring them to school and sell them and make a profit. That was, if you like, a childhood dream when I was 7, 8, 9, 10. But that passed quickly. It never came up again until I was a young adult.
I guess this is just from the information that I could find on you. Your first taste of a career was in the British Merchant Navy as a radio officer. So what was that like, and why did you decide to go down that route?
Yes, and we can come back to entrepreneurship a little later because it didn't surface very strongly later on. But the Merchant Navy was simply a wonderful opportunity to get my career on the line, on the road. I was coming out of a boarding school where they taught us through Irish, so I learned nothing. I scraped through I managed to get honours in Latin and oddly enough in English because it was quite fluent in English. And I went to university. We had no career guidance at all. I had no party to it, no nothing. I had no idea. I asked my mother. She said you can be a priest or a doctor or a dentist. So I said, which one makes most money? She said the dentist. So I studied dentistry, or rather I went to university and blew the year. Totally flunked it. Coming out of a country boarding school, age 16, I wasn't ready for the big time. So I discovered girls and beer and had a lovely time, and was at my wit's end when an uncle suggested the opportunity to study for 9 months and qualify as a radio officer, which meant I would be sailing the oceans wide and a jolly good salary. It was a beautiful career, and I loved it enormously for 2 years. If you can imagine, Lucy, coming back, locked up in a boarding school, then into a ship sailing. We went to South America, to the West Indies, to you name it, Cuba. It was gorgeous. Gin was 2 shillings a bottle. We were all found, totally, purely looked after. And it turned out to be a very important finishing school. Because again, I go back to the 50s in Monaghan, in a country school. It was a good boarding school, but all boarding schools in the 40s to 50s were recovering from the war. Times were hard. But ours was particularly geared towards the priesthood, so we weren't allowed access to various things. When I went into the Merchant Navy, it got me sophisticated enough to be able to move on into more important things. I loved it.
Sounds like you had quite the experience. All the travel sounds absolutely amazing that you got to do. Um, and so why did you leave there, or did you always know it was only going to be a certain amount of time?
I really, on my first deep sea, it was when I first went into deep water overseas. Captain Green looked at me after about when he got to know me after a few weeks and said, "Young man, what are you doing wasting your time? You're in a dead end job, you realize." And I was disappointed because to me it was a marvelous career. But he was right. And after 18 months, I realized that it was a dead end job. And eventually I would finish up like Captain Green. There's nowhere to go. So things took a turn, if you like. Life took over there. At one point, I went back to Wireless College to do another diploma and get some more qualifications, which I got. And I had put my name down for another ship when my mother called from Monaghan to say there had been a fire. Would I please come home and sort it out? So life took over there. I had to go home and sort it out. And that's where my entrepreneurial skills started for the first time because I loved working in the shop. I turned it around within 6 months. I turned it around and turned it into a profitable organization, paid off all the debts, all the fire damage. And so I moved on from there. That's what happened. To answer your question, that's how I left the Merchant Navy. After that, it was a case of getting a job and getting on with life. So I went back to England because talking now in the 50s, there weren't many jobs in Ireland. And I was qualified as an engineer, not very highly qualified, but medium qualified, not up to university level, but good enough for practical artisan work. So I quickly got into two good jobs. Well, pardon me, good jobs. The first was not good. The second one was very interesting because, again, looking back on life, this is where my entrepreneurship kicked in. I enjoyed the cut and thrust of Monaghan, bringing a business back into profit. And now I was working for the Radio Corporation of America. Not an important job, but an interesting one. My job was to install and monitor the sound systems cinemas. One of them in particular was the Odeon in Lime Street, Liverpool, which had a huge audience. And I was working for RCA, and the equipment in the cinema was RCA equipment. At that time, by coincidence, RCA America introduced a very fine record player. I came up with the idea with the manager of the Odeon in M Street. Here you have all these people walking through your foyer every day, every week rather. Why don't we put it to this RCA equipment in the showrooms and you can sell it? You've got a front window, you've got cash flow already, you've got all your organization that you can manage this. And to me, it was an obvious winner, a win-win, that RCA would sell the equipment and ABC and the cinemas would make the profit. That was my first business, silly idea. I was 22. It didn't work because SCA didn't. Yes, RCA was a huge American corporation, and ABC Cinemas, Odeon Cinemas were huge. They both refused. I insisted with my boss in Manchester it was a good idea. I nearly got myself sacked.
And then, so how did you make the swap from engineering to the petroleum industry, or what initially sparked your interest in that?
Usually it was a simple thing called getting a job. I was only 22, 23. I needed the job. It's as simple as that. And I had two, as I just said, I was with RCA, which is a lovely job. I had a brand new car, first class accommodation, all the hotels, but I needed something better. And when the Shell job came up, now here I'm bringing the element in of luck. You say luck. I will repeat this several times. Luck is when opportunity meets preparedness. So if you like, I was now prepared thanks to the Merchant Navy and RCA. I was a fairly sophisticated young fella. I wasn't the same guy I'd come out to sit in the cartons years earlier. And I applied for the Shell job, which was upper middle class, very much middle class, very much middle class. Most of the people applying had degrees. Most of them were VIPs. They captained the English rugby team, for example, that sort of person. Shell had a very high reputation, and they wanted people over 24. And I was 23, but I took the view that people probably wouldn't add two together. They called me for an interview. I joined Shell Max and PP Limited in Great Britain. And I didn't know at that stage I was going to spend the next 30 years in oil. But in fact, that's how it worked out. For me, it was a job. It was a very interesting job. And that's why I saw the oil opportunity. One of our customers, I should explain that what the job was, introducing the concept of, this will surprise you, at that time, Lucy, very few private houses in England or Ireland and these islands had central heating. Shell came up, in fact it was the Coal Board came up with the idea before the First and Second World War, but they didn't, Shell picked up the idea. It's a little bit technical, but in the old days, central heating was in churches and in big houses where the diameter of the pipes were 1.5 to 2.5 inches. So there was no resistance to hot water circulating in big houses. But to do that in a private, smaller, a semi-detached house, the Shell came up with the idea, put a pump in and pump the water. And that means you can then use a small little boiler and tiny pipes, as small as your finger, if you like, that can be run around the property. So they introduced oil-fired central heating. So that brought me into the idea, into the area of combustion of fuel. And in the middle of Birmingham, which was it's called the Black Country, a huge industrial area, I became, if I may say so, fairly expert in how to burn oil and where to burn it. Britain had just passed the Clean Air Act, which encouraged people to stop burning coal, convert to natural gas or oil. It gave us a wonderful opportunity, gave Shell a wonderful opportunity, and me, to convert people who had been burning coal for generations, teach them how to burn oil. And so that gave me a fair grounding in industrial fuels. And at that time, I saw one man was collecting waste oil and using some of my oil to make it a little bit more flammable, if you like, or combustible. And I got that idea. That's interesting. He's using waste oil and turning it into a fuel. Yeah, that's a good idea. And I parked that, forgot about it. But at that time, I was beginning to get aggressively determined to start up on my own. And I did some silly things. I actually went to the Russian embassy, got an appointment to meet the secretary of the Russian embassy to import Russian oil and sell it in competition with Shell. Now, I was 24, as I was 25. Silly. It was just a silly idea. But the Russians treated me very well, gave me a cup of coffee, humored me, and I was busy learning the golden rule that a good idea is only a good idea, not a business.
But what was it like for you at that time? You know, as an individual, you had this really great job, to take that risk and go out on your own. I know that you knew that you wanted to build something for yourself, but it must have been a little scary, you know, going out on your own when you didn't know if it was going to work or not.
It was very scary because by that time, and I tell it rather better in the book because a number of things happened that helped me along the line. One was the introduction into Sligo. Shell transferred me back to Sligo. More gratuitous thing because firstly it was crazy. I was coming from an industrial area and they moved me to an agricultural area that had no industry at all. But I was able to combine. It meant I had enough knowledge that I could. It was the only industrial fuel engineer in the west of Ireland, which meant that every factory that came into the west of Ireland, on every one of them, fell in love with a lovely lady in Sligo, and The Junior Chamber of Commerce was started, a thing called Junior Chamber. You've heard of the Senior Chamber, but you may not be familiar with Junior Chamber. We started one up in opposition to the Senior Chamber, who didn't want us, wondered why we were doing it. And they made me the public relations officer, started to produce a magazine called Visitor's Guide to Sligo, and worked with two of the other chamber members, both of whom were senior managers in big factories. And I thought to myself, why am I a sales rep while these two guys are running factories? And it gave me the self-confidence. And this was the first time I worked on my own. Again, another person took over and gave me a job and persuaded me to leave Shell. And he did. And it was quite terrifying to head off to Dublin. We were very well established in Sligo. We had built a lovely house, friends had grown up there. And to leave that and head off for Dublin, where we had no contacts, no friends, no relations. But we started up there, and again, I did the same thing. I bought a house with a garden, turned it into a new house. In fact, it's there now on the top of York Road. It's a big old derelict property. We were building up a little cash flow, and I was determined to find something to do. I was still working with this friend in Dublin, steam boilers, and doing some quite well. But I was looking at every opportunity, including some very odd ones, because I have that little bit of capital now. And then I mentioned luck earlier. I will mention luck again and again. Luck, as I said, is when opportunity comes along and you're ready for it. I was now ready. Now I was probably 30. I had built the three houses. I had some considerable self-confidence and experience. I found a HMSO, Her Majesty's Statutory Office, sent a little book around to everybody. I picked one up somewhat casually for 2 and 6 minutes. How to grow your own tomato. So I read the book and I thought, that sounds fairly simple. I think I can do that. And with that handbook for half a crown, I went down to Sligo with Helen for the weekend. I was planning at this stage to start collecting this waste oil. And to collect waste oil is all over the island of Ireland. Sligo is not the best place. Also, with the weather and the rain and the lack of sunshine, not the best place for growing tomatoes. But I haven't told you this, but I had spent a year and a half trying to find some land on the East Coast that I could to start with this oil recycling business. I went to the tomato growers in North Dublin and said, will you buy my oil and at half the price you're paying to Shell? Yes, of course we will. Where is it? I didn't have it. So I realized I had to somehow start up a business, burn the oil myself. So I decided tomatoes was a very big user, very, very large user of oil. So if I grow a tomato farm and heat it with my own oil, that will give me a cash flow to let us move on to the next stage, and B, it will enable me to produce the product. So when Joe Moss offered me that opportunity, offered to me at a price I could afford, and on the driving back to Dublin on Monday night, I honestly can tell you that by the time I reached Mullingar, I had worked out the marketing of the tomato farm. And then we went for the big one, the oil. That was a long battle with the Industrial Development Authority, the IDA, the Irish government, the IDA. I had to persuade them that we were doing, which we hardly did. It was a bit like tomatoes again. We knew we could burn waste oil, but we didn't know half the technology that would be required, and to learn it. And we did. We learned it, and we eventually got together.
That's amazing. And obviously, you built up this incredible company for yourself. As you said, it's such an achievement. And it sounds like so much blood, sweat, and tears went into it. So what I'm really curious about, A lot of people are lucky if they even have one business in them, let alone the multitude that you have had in you. So, what made you decide to then move on from oil, leave it behind you completely, and go into consulting?
I'd been in the oil business for 30 years. That was long enough. There was a big world out there. We also had sold our business for a considerable sum of money. So we were like rich. That didn't last long. But when you're retired, and this was something that a lot of people realize when it comes to them, when you're retired, it's like being out of work.
Yeah.
You have nothing to get up to do. And I was quickly bored, and I have a very patient mind, a very, yes, inquiring and inquisitive mind. And I would always want to be doing something. So I put a few flyers out. A number of the national organizations appointed me onto various boards. And one of them said, hey, we're starting up a new organization in venture capital analysis that you will be analyzing. We're going to put a fund together to help those people. Will you join us? So that's what brought me to that. I was, again, just looking to keep myself busy.
What brought you towards writing? It's such a contrast towards, I guess, a career so heavily involved in business and management. It's kind of surprising that you have that creative side to you as well, that you wanted to write. So, where did your interest come from there?
That came after I retired again,
Yeah.
and came back to live in Ireland, which was about 10 years ago. But yes, about 12 years ago. And we were a very close family, and they like the old man prattling on about stories. So I always told them the various things that were going on, good and bad, and the adventures I was having. So the family said, including my wife, said, write it all down, because when you're dead, we won't remember it all. So I wrote my book about 12 years ago, The Way It Was. I called it The Way It Was. And that was that for about 6 or 7 years. We did various things. My mind took over then because I've got the unfortunate mind that won't shut up. It thinks all the time. So I thought, well, I'm enjoying writing, so I'll rewrite my memoirs the way I had done it 10 years earlier, rewrite them and add on a lot of stuff I had cut out before in more detail. So that's what these benches of a serial entrepreneur is, my life story told.
Leading on from that, I'd be really curious to know if you did have a personal definition of what success means to you.
I think it means peace.
Do you feel like you've achieved that at this point in your life?
I certainly do. You're talking to one of the happiest men on the planet. I've got a married his wife, and we're married now for 57, 58 years.
Wow.
You know, in love with each other. It's just wonderful. And we have got 4 marvelous children who are themselves married, 4 marvelous people. And we all love each other. And we're all best friends. And I couldn't be happier.
And if you could, I suppose, go back to day one with your own businesses once you started on that journey of entrepreneurship, do you have any one major thing that sticks in your head that you would have done differently if you could do it again?
I would have to say no, as far as you're really, as an entrepreneur, reacting to the word opportunity again. And you really have got to react to the opportunity. If the opportunity isn't there, you can't react to it. So, no, I don't think I could really do other than look for the opportunity and react to it. I guess if you ask me what an entrepreneur, and this, I'm writing a new book called Do You Want to Be an Entrepreneur?
Oh, cool.
Yeah, you should read it because you're a young lady setting out in your career. You're well onto one now, I can see. This one will be, so you want to be an entrepreneur, and it's me trying to advise people how they might go about it. And the advice I would give to any entrepreneur is to wait until you're ready.
That's an
And
interesting one because I feel
that's a
like a
tricky
lot,
question.
yeah, I feel like a lot of people almost tell you the opposite, to just jump in and figure it out as you go, but you're saying that you would rather wait until you know you're ready to take it on.
Well, I can only speak from personal experience, and I've just told you the things I was doing when I
Yeah.
was 22. But by the time I was 27 or 28, I had a lot of water gone on the bridge. I had built up a lot of experience, and I was ready. And and what I did was a significant, fairly big achievement. I couldn't have done that when I was 22.
If you could pick one piece of advice that you would go back and give your 10-year-old self, what would it be?
Oh, 10-year-old self, no doubt, wait until you're ready.
It's been so interesting chatting to you. And I really do appreciate you giving up your time to share all of your experiences. And I'm definitely going to go and read your book because I want to know more about the adventures you had along the way. Some of the places you said you've traveled sound amazing. So yeah, thank you so much, Fred. I really appreciate it.
Lucy, I enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you so much for listening, and as always, please rate, share, and leave a comment if you like what you hear. And don't forget to follow @WhatIt'sLikePod on Instagram and Facebook. To find out more about Fred and to read his latest book, visit the links provided in the show notes. I'll be back on Thursday with more inspiring stories, but for now, this has been What It's Like with Luce.